listening to Coffee and Conversation with Recovery Advocate Network, the nonprofit organization that strives to address the staggering disparity in resource availability for individuals suffering from mental health disorders, processing disorders, addictions, trauma healing, and sexual identity challenges. Together, we strive to end the stigma associated with these challenges so that true healing can begin. Welcome back to Coffee and Conversation with Recovery Advocate Network. I'm your host, and welcome you to episode number 18, the third in our book club series. Today, our guest, Dan Joseph, author of the book Backpack to Rucksack, Insight into Leadership and Resilience by Military Experts, and I will discuss a variety of leadership topics such as corporate culture, team leadership, boundaries, and empathy, as well as sensitive topics including suicide, domestic abuse, violence, drug abuse, sexual abuse, and the impact of adverse childhood experiences, those ACE scores. We kicked off the episode with working through our own personal challenges as we provide a voice to others struggling. Dan through his book and being an author advocate, and me through this podcast and running a nonprofit mental health organization. Dan's book offers practical and actionable guidance on leadership and resilience from the perspective of military experts. Drawing on his extensive knowledge and experiences, he provides valuable insights and relatable anecdotes that make the concepts accessible and applicable to a wide range of readers. The book emphasizes the importance of leadership in various contexts, from the military to corporate settings, and provides practical tips and real-world examples that can be implemented in everyday life. Dan's conversational writing style is very engaging and motivational, making the book an enjoyable and inspiring read. I thoroughly enjoyed it. One of the book's standout features is its emphasis on resilience. Dan highlights the significance of resilience in the face of challenges and provides strategies for developing mental toughness, adaptability, and self-care. He also delves into the psychological and emotional aspects of resilience, offering practical tools for bouncing back from setbacks and thriving in the face of adversity. Dan is an Army veteran with a master's degree in organizational psychology. Since this episode deals with so many sensitive topics, we want to remind you that if you feel triggered, we encourage you to contact your support system, therapist, national and community support groups, the Global Crisis Text Line by texting 741-741, and if you're in the United States, dialing 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. If you need other resources such as shelter, support groups, transportation, food, and/or a safe, confidential path out of physical and/or emotional domestic abuse, please call 211 or visit www.211info.org for assistance. We gave a little teaser in the episode that we had listeners in many countries around the world. However, as of the recording of this intro, we have even more. We now have listeners in 16 countries around the world. One item I struggle with is I don't have those treatment support group resources available for all of those countries. So if you live in one of those countries, please provide that information to me. I would love to include it to listeners so that they can listen to future episodes and have those resources to keep them safe and secure, and so that they can thrive in the face of adversity. So, now what are we waiting for? Fill up your coffee, sit back, and let's get started. Good afternoon, listeners. This is Anne, your podcast host, and I am very excited to have with me today Dan, author of the book Backpack to Rucksack, He actually reached out to the podcast after hearing an episode. He apparently is an avid podcast listener, which I love. I also am an avid podcast listener. And so he's been listening to quite a few podcasts in the mental health space and reaching out to try and share similar messages on those. So I think that's amazing. He's here today. And so, Dan, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us why you're here?
Hey everybody, thanks so much for having me. This is awesome. It's so cool to just feel the love and support as a vet. I just got out of the army less than a year ago and wrote a book after dealing with quite a bit of weight, and we'll kind of unpack that. A lot of there's just been a lot on my heart lately, and just the fact that there are people like you who are willing to give us a voice, give me a voice to discuss what's been going on behalf of the men and women that I've led and got to serve with, who've done some amazing things for our nation. It's so cool to just have a seat at your table. I'm really excited to kind of let the listeners in on what we're going to talk about. Anything mental health related, psychology. My background's in cell bio, so I love the neurophysiology of feelings and think you're going to help me guide myself through some things today.
Absolutely. We both kind of agreed, not kind of, we agreed we were
Mm.
going to help each other through some emotional challenges that we're both experiencing with our current journeys in life. Dan is an author and he's an avid member of the veteran community, working with individuals who really have struggle coming back and integrating back into their world. And I'm going to let him talk about that. And then, as you know, podcast listeners, I struggle. I've shared a lot of my personal story and struggling after escaping from my kidnapping and getting out of recovery. But also, I struggle as being the host of this podcast because it's an amazing gift to be able to provide a voice to so many guests. And at the same time, it is a challenge because a part of that gift means that in order to put it into an episode so that listeners can listen to it around the world. And I'm very grateful so far. We have listeners in 11 countries, including Kenya. I thought it was so cool when someone in Kenya started listening to it. I was just like, oh, I just got goosebumps I literally got goosebumps thinking that someone in Kenya was listening to some of the diverse topics that were in here. And at the same point, I have shared with my therapist actually just on Friday with my psychiatrist who's known me since I was first in treatment after my kidnapping. And he said, do you think that the podcast is helping to keep you accountable in your recovery journey? And I said, I don't know, because the hours that I spend editing and formulating and working with the podcast, I hear these individual stories over and over. So example, one episode may take over 4 hours just to edit. So then you add the extra 2 hours of going, that's 6 hours of thinking about that individual's life and the impact. And so I think about it when I get up in the morning and when I go to bed at night. And also I share little bits of myself. I'm very vulnerable in that. And so there are parts of me that I feel that that's healing and other parts of it that really weighs on me. And so, Dan, when you and I just were talking a minute ago before we pressed record, which I actually really regret that I had not already pressed record, because you were sharing some vulnerable moments that you felt some similar emotions. And so, can you kind of share a little bit about what your day's been like today and
Yeah.
recently, especially with some things individuals have shared with you and what they want you to share either on this podcast or in some
Mhm.
books or something like that?
Yeah, thank you so much for, again, for hearing me on this. And, maybe we could put like a little bit of a warning on this episode because I don't want to cause any harm with the stuff I'm going to say, but
I will put
uh,
lots of trigger warnings in the
cool. Yeah.
beginning. So, yes,
Then
absolutely.
I'll be okay. Then I'll just be fully open about what's going on. So I have some friends who are struggling with suicidality, who have struggled with depression quite a bit in the military, active duty, as well as veterans. And so in the intro of my book, my soldier Cody wrote the introduction. He survived his suicide attempt. My last week as platoon leader, I was a combat engineer in the Army, and I never deployed to combat, but I worked with many men and women who were deployed. And so Cody's story forever impacted me because, when he told me he survived a suicide attempt, I called his mother, made sure she knew he was alive. He's still alive today. We still check in on each other. And his story, it's not super easy to share that. It's not easy to market that as a part of a book marketing campaign, if you will. It needs to be honored with the weight that is, right? There's so much weight to that. The foreword was written by my friend, my dear friend and brother, Austin. And Austin lost 12 men from his unit to suicide prior to my book being published. After publishing it, the 13th individual took his life. I still check in on Austin to make sure he's alive and well. And he is. He is. But there's been times where it's come close, where I thought he might not pick up the phone. And that weighed on me. Because again, this is a book that I wrote, but it's not just a book, it's a story about these men's lives, right? And I just spoke with a mentor of mine who years ago, when he got back from deployment, he nearly took someone's life, committed homicide, because he felt so desensitized to what he saw in combat. And when he returned to the States, he was bullied by somebody, pushed him to a point psychologically where he believed in his heart the best way to get out of this, to escape this, is to kill this individual. And what I opened up to you about was that, based on what a woman told me a couple days ago, I spoke with her on the phone. She's a veteran who coaches other vets on PTS. We dropped the D because we're not calling it a disorder, because it's part of just neurophysiology for them to have this reaction, is kind of the concept here. So we don't want to make them feel ashamed of what they're going through. Essentially, what's happening is there's a weight that I'm feeling in telling these stories, right? Because I'm getting trusted with these stories that people are telling me that they've never told a therapist. They haven't told their spouses. They haven't told another human being sometimes. And I'm honored to hear these stories. And yet at the same time, when people are saying, why aren't you pushing your book? Why aren't you reaching out to people? It took me 8 months before I sent an email to you to get this conversation going, because I was so fearful, ashamed, kind of weighed down, if you will, by there's just a heaviness to this, right? And I want to honor what these combat veterans have gone through, what these service members have gone through, right? And what's weird to me, and this is where I needed conversations like these to help me, when I'm being trusted to tell their story, because they don't want a spotlight. They don't want people to see their face while they're telling these stories. They don't necessarily have the vocabulary to speak of this stuff in a fluid manner. They've allowed me to be their voice. But at the same time, I feel guilt that they're not getting credit for it, that they're not the one. They do deserve the spotlight. They do deserve the affirmation, those words of love and acceptance and redemption for what they've seen. And so me being a conduit for them is awesome. I love that I'm able to do that. But I suppose at the same time, the and is that I didn't expect the weight of it, and just kind of, I want to call it confusion. It maybe a better word is the tension, the internal tension of, I'm going to speak for them, but at the same time I feel as if I want them to speak for themselves and have that voice, but they don't want that. So I'm going to continue stepping in for them. But I just feel like I owe them so much, because I've seen, working with them in uniform, right? I've seen that look in their eyes. I've seen the weight they carry. I've seen what happens when a toxic leader pushes somebody and that leader has no idea the demons that this person is fighting. They don't know the trauma this person carries, not only from combat, by the way, but all the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences that have happened. And I write about this in the book, that much more than the normative population, that the military population recruits from a pool of people that have far more ACEs. I think it's like threefold. And so there's just so much weight, and there's so much that people in uniform carry. Yeah, this process is a lot deeper than I thought it would be. Writing a book was a way of getting this off of my chest. But then, as you said with your podcasts, as I speak about the book, that weight is still there. And I don't think it's going anywhere. And maybe it doesn't have to. And that's where you come in to educate me.
I'll quote your book because I highlighted it because I was also surprised. So it is on, and here's where I know I am getting old. I just turned 48 earlier this month. I'm teasing. I recently I recently, listeners, maybe the police will come arrest me. I did jump a fence to take a nighttime picture of the Stanford dish. And I did it when I was 47. And after I did scale the fence and got to the other end, I said to my buddy, who I won't disclose because, and I said, my 17-year-old self will be so proud of my badass 47-year-old
Nice.
self. Anyway, I do need the reading glasses. Okay, so I will read from your book. So on page 257, we talk about that. This also surprised me, where you said most military service members are well acquainted with adversity. That did not surprise me. What did was one study of 162 soldiers found 83% experienced adverse childhood experiences early in life, including domestic violence, drug abuse, physical abuse, psychological abuse, and more. Many joined the military to escape horrific living situations at home. Without appropriately receiving adequate care for such trauma, they often suffer more than others when experiencing combat-induced trauma. Despite such compounding damage, they seek community and purpose by putting on the uniform. I thought that was so
Mm.
impactful. And listeners, on episode number 13, we talked about the link between childhood trauma and addiction. We walked through the adverse childhood experiences and the ACE scores. And I shared in that episode that my ACE score was 8. And so I completely related to that. And yeah, that was just mind boggling when I read it. So I highlighted it and took notes on it because I saw that.
Wow.
So I'm glad. First off, I love just how vulnerable you are about sharing these conflicting feelings that you're having. And I get it. And I was thinking when you were talking about those individuals that they should get the credit. And I was relating in some areas because I have some guests who I have a particular guest who I really want to be on as a guest on the episode. And she doesn't want to be a guest because she's worried someone will recognize her voice. And so I've convinced her, I said, I know how to use the software now to edit the voice. And she has a phenomenal story. And then I have, another guest with eating disorder challenges, a very similar scenario. And so I have those individuals that are really nervous about it. And then I have another individual. So Maddie's story is episode 9, which is our second highest download thus far. Amazing episode. And so whereas, this is a little different too, because the podcast is everyone's a complete volunteer. So I don't make any funds or any profits or anything out of this. I just do it in my free time. And so there's that. All funds raised go directly towards scholarships for individuals who need treatment. So, but for Maddie, what's really cool is that as her numbers and her downloads continue to upload, I get the opportunity to send her a text message and say, hey, your downloads are now at this number. Or when people respond and they say, this story really spoke to me. Or when, for example, my therapist who shares these, and he's going to listen to this in a couple of weeks and say, oh, I heard you give me a shout out again. Anyway, when he says that, then I go to her and say that. And so she can get a little bit more healing out of that. And so that's kind of like how she's getting a little bit of her healing by hearing that out in the public. I also had a scenario where I recently recorded an episode and the individual was very nervous. And that individual, I had already started editing that particular episode because that individual did struggle in the episode. And that individual sent me a text and said, I want to re-record it. And I had to take a pause because I do this on the side. It takes a lot of my free time to do this, but I am very passionate about getting these voices out and getting the message out because people need to hear it. And so I had to pause and say, what are my healthy boundaries? Because a healthy boundary is no is a complete sentence. I can say no. However, this is this individual's personal life story of trauma, tragedy, and recovery. And so I made the decision to allow this individual to re-record their episode. And the subsequent episode was phenomenal. And so even just watching that individual in the second recording and that healing that they were able to have in that was touching to my heart and to be able to be the conduit. And so I think, and part of the healing part for me is the challenge of editing and hearing the stories and also relating to them. There have been episodes I've cried while editing them. I shared with you before I pressed record, darn it, that I hadn't pressed record yet, but I shared that there were episodes that I've recorded that I have had to stop while editing them and say, I can't edit it anymore today. I just have to go home and do it another day because the emotional weight is just too much.
Yeah, definitely. This is so cool hearing it. This is what's awesome about the recovery community is in the midst of sort of the chaos, in the midst of sort of the brokenness, right? We can meet and we can discuss this stuff. There doesn't have to be clarity and resolution in the moment. It can be this ongoing process. And I've heard, because I've been in recovery groups based on self-medicative processes I picked up from childhood trauma that I talk about in the book. But what I was told is that recovery is sort of it's scaling a mountain in a circular fashion where each time you come around the mountain, you face the same issue, but you're that much more elevated each go around. So don't get discouraged when you're constantly, why am I still struggling with this? Why is this still heavy? You do have just that little bit more enlightenment each time you come around it. But there's not this need to say, I need to hit the summit. I need to be at the top of this. Because when I got out of the army, I thought, okay, these issues are going to be minimized. Now I'm not going to be in certain environments with certain people. I'll be able to decompress. But I didn't realize like how much anger I had. I didn't realize how much angst I had because I wished I could have fixed certain situations. And granted, that probably touches on early childhood stuff where I want to reach back in time and correct that person, right? Tell the abuser, like, you will not treat me like this. You will not behave like this. You're going to respect this boundary. Here is a boundary. Let me figure out what these healthy boundaries are and implement them. And I wish I did that more in, I want to say I wish I did that more in the military, but it's not so much that I could have because it's other people's boundaries that needed to be there themselves. I can't go within with the savior complex and say, I'm here to fix everything, right? The only issue is because I've been in recovery groups before I joined the military, I had vocabulary for these observations. That's not right. That's a boundary violation. That's shame. That right there is dog whistling. That right there is triangulation. That's projection. This person's maladaptive behavior is coming out in the way that they're talking to people in this brief.
I
And
don't know what dog whistling is. I know what some of the
oh,
other ones are. And also, we have listeners from all different walks of life. So maybe if you could just describe what a couple of these are, because I do know what
sure.
triangulation is, but a lot of our
Yeah.
audience may not know what some of these are. So maybe just for really quick, go through what a couple of these are.
Yeah, so dog whistling would be, let's say you're in a group of soldiers and one of them just failed their PT test. Dog whistling would be a leader coming up to that group, knowing that that person is there who's experiencing some shame about having failed a physical fitness test. And then of all things that this individual would come up and talk about is just say something about a physical therapy or a physical fitness test. They bring up a topic in such a dismissible way, knowing that there's an individual that once they hear it, their ears are going to perk up. Oh, wait. Oh, yeah, I just failed that. So it's using certain words or phrases in order to trigger. And I know that's people are getting sick of that word, but to get somebody listening in a way that's going to remind them that they failed at something and make them feel that shame. And it's super, I hate it when I see it. And I've felt it growing up. I know what it means. And what that person will then say is, I didn't say that. I didn't mean that. I didn't mean it that way. You're just sensitive. You're just blah, 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 whatever they are completely invalidating of that person's human experience. It's manipulative. There's, obviously gaslighting. We know what that is. But like, for instance, I said maladaptive behaviors. So I've had a lot of these. So a maladaptive behavior is, chest pounding, right? Like I'm the alpha, I'm the big one here because why? I feel that I'm actually the smallest person here. So it's a compensatory mechanism, an ego defensive compensatory mechanism that's truly meant to just be harmful. It's not, there's no sort of pro-social element to it. It's not there to build others up. It's not there to make anyone stronger. It's there as a self-serving I'm the leader here and you're all going to respect me because I'm the number one person. You all are, basically serve me in my position, which is the antithesis of leadership. Because the higher you are ranked in an organization, the more people you are serving as that leader. And there are certain people that live that out and you feel it like a breath of fresh air. I mean, you just see people, their eyes are brighter, their posture is straighter, they're able to make direct eye contact, they're able to make mistakes and not feel shame. But then you see these organizations where it's the opposite, and they're very indirect with their eye contact, they're very quick to leave the room, they minimize contact with others because the overarching culture is that you're going to be shamed, you're going to be put down, you're going to be put on blast for your very just human traits. And this is where leadership takes on either a dark and heavy and sinister tone or a healing, nurturing, healthy tone that strengthens people. And there's what's crazy about this is there are arguments on both sides of the table, and there's logic on both sides. Believe it or not, I mean, I've seen some fairly, what I believe were toxic individuals have some pretty logical arguments as to why they're behaving a certain way. It can be, and this is the part it's just like splitting hairs, but they say things like, if I behave like this, I'm keeping people on their toes so the enemy doesn't catch them. I'm making sure their hypervigilance keeps them safe. I'm the person that's stress testing the organization. But at what point, and this is where the question gets begged, at what point does stress testing the organization turn into toxic behavior that is destroying the resiliency and the mental health of others? That's where I come in, writing a book and still struggling with the discussion.
I love it. I am a member of Chief, and Chief is a group of executive women in the C-suite. And we have executive coaching, so we have core groups, and I love my core group. It's amazing. We meet once every 6 weeks. And as part of that, I'm trying to pull up the author of this. We've been studying positive intelligence by Shazad. I cannot pronounce his last name. Shamin, I think. Anyway, he's out of California, I believe out of Stanford. Anyway, amazing, because he does talk about the different parts of our brain and that part of our brain that just convinces us that that control freak of us is there for a reason. And that if we did not have that control freak as a leader, then this, that, or the other would not get done. And he gives an example of where he went in as an executive coach into a company that had a newer CEO, and the company was very dysfunctional. And he met individually with each of the team members because the company used to be very functional. And the team members said, hey, we used to be very functional, but then the CEO came in, and the CEO is just like, they won't step up, they won't get stuff done, da, 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 da. And each of the team members said, well, we slowly learned that whenever we tried to say something, we got shot down, and it's this typical thing. You and I've heard it over and over and over again. So what did they do? They stopped speaking up. They stopped putting themselves out there. It was the classic self-fulfilling prophecy that happened within that organization and was destroying the organization. It wasn't until that individual, the CEO, was able to then learn the damage that he was causing to all those individuals. And you wrote about it in your book. Later in the book, I'm trying to see exactly where it was, because some individuals call it hit by the bus philosophy. I used to say, and I use it in the company that I'm building now, because one of the areas in my corporate world that I work on is scalability and sustainability. And so I try and get everyone to build something that then somebody else can come in and take right after. And the company I built before this, the reason they were so successful is I just hired a whole bunch of people that were way, way, way smarter than me. Every single step of the way, 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 way smarter than me. And it played out really well, because then when I had my kidnapping event and then went into treatment for 6 months, the company continued to run great without me. I mean, awesome. And I still have a lot of equity in that company. So I'm really happy the company continued to run really great. And I remember we were rolling out software to Advent Health in Florida. And I was explaining to each of our customers about setting up their systems and how to set it up so that anyone can walk in and do it if they're not there. And I said, at Florence, which is the name of this other company, we try and think of, and I said, I used to call it hit by the bus. I kind of feel like that's morbid. You and I are both cyclists, and I had lost a friend to a cycling accident. So I said, I feel like that's morbid. So now I just say, in case someone gets hit by the lottery, then somebody else can come in. And it was so funny because one of my team members, Catalina, who's still at Florence, she said, I have a question. Do you play the lottery? And I said, no. And she said, okay, good. But that whole idea of leadership and building teams that they are able to speak up, able to make eye contact, that somewhere in here you talk about being quiet, being humble, and giving them a voice and not shutting them down, not dog whistling, which now I've learned a new term. I think of it more of like a passive aggressive type comment that you would have with someone, not doing those types of behaviors, but lifting those around you. And also, you talk a lot in the book about the fact that you don't know what those around you have gone through. So one of the areas that I really love is you say leaders who bring unresolved emotions to the workplace force everyone around them to experience their dysregulated mood states. So listeners, I hope you buy the book. It's on page 71 of the book. And that I highlighted and wrote that down as part of something to tell my leaders to remember is that, first off, I always say to people, you never know when somebody else is reacting to something. You don't know what filter they're seeing things through. So I had this an example, and then I'm going to shut up because I want to hear from you and not have listeners hear from me. But I want to share one example about culture, because the next thing that really surprised me, and it should have surprised me because I had already read about your history and your culture. So I do want to tie into this, but did surprise me the portion about talking about the military and learning to work with diverse cultures, because I have to admit, when I, as a human being, visualize the military, I don't really visualize it as a diverse culture. That's not the stereotype I see. And I apologize to listeners. It's a very ignorant statement that I just said. And when I read that, I realized how ignorant that statement was. Anyways, so one of the things that I was thinking about when I was reading parts of this was an example where I led my previous company at a team in the US, a team in Belgrade, and a team in Bolivia. And some of my individuals in Belgrade and Bolivia were both quality engineers working with software. Okay. And suddenly I heard from the team that there was conflict between the two groups. And so I said, have the two groups talked to each other? And the leader's like, well, yeah, they're kind of via Slack. And I was like, no. So I figured out, in one book that I recommend for individuals that are trying to learn how to lead teams across different cultures is the book Culture Map. Phenomenal. And so what I did was I had a Zoom. I had everyone get on Zoom, cameras on. I said, we're not going to talk about work. We're going to go around, and everyone, I want you to talk about yourself, your family, your hobbies. Everyone's going to get to know each other as a human being. And then at the end, I said, okay, here's the deal. I've worked with all of you, and I understand this. The problem was that the Belgrade team was looking at some of the software, and they said, this is wrong. Well, in Bolivia, in the culture, if you say something is wrong, it is the same thing as saying you are stupid, Dan. But in Belgrade, it's just wrong. It's not stupid. It's just wrong. Okay. Neither one of them meant any harm to each other, but they didn't understand that culture and those words and that language for each other. They didn't understand the filter. They, as leaders, didn't understand how to cross those cultural barriers. And so by having that conversation and me saying to the Belgrade team, you need to understand this is how the Bolivia team's understanding it. And to the Bolivia team, this is what the Belgrade team means. They just mean there's a bug in the software. That's it. That was just amazing, the difference in that team and understanding, seeing humans as humans. So going back to what you just said, when someone comes in and they're meeting you and, you see them in the grocery store and they're really upset, you don't know if something just happened to them outside. You don't know what their challenge is.
Yeah, I mean, this is all what complicates leadership, right? Because there's so many, and this goes back to why I wrote the book, because we're humans, right? We have feelings, and that's going to come out for sure in our leadership style. But then the mission set, the criteria of what we're trying to execute has nothing to do with what we're feeling. We're going to move the convoy from this grid coordinate to that grid coordinate, get everybody in these positions. These are the security parameters. And so you carry it over. But what I noticed, so how I talk about it is like the logistical part, 1 + 1 is 2, right? Simple math until you throw your emotions in it. Then it becomes this calculus with imaginary numbers type situation where you see the way a leader speaks to somebody or the way that they're talking. It just completely added so much more stress and tension to the situation. And that's just it just compounds the complexity is when you throw people's mood states, you throw in sleep deprivation and crazy austere conditions and weather exposure, and that much more so it just stresses everybody out. But about the multicultural aspect or the diversity, I learned so much from my soldiers because they taught me about their their childhood experiences, what they came from. And one thing that's a superpower of as somebody who's suffered abuse at a younger age is that I can empathize with others, and I have this desire to be validated, and so because of that, I like to validate others. It's this thing I realize that whatever my deficits are, if I give that to somebody else, it's healing for me. So what I would do is when I talk to my soldiers, because we were in the field a lot, right? And even though I was an officer and they're enlisted, I mean, we lived and slept in the same areas, right? There's no privacy when you're just living out of a vehicle in the middle of a desert for weeks at a time. And so I'd ask them, "Hey, what's your family life back home? What are your goals and aspirations? What are some of the challenges you've had in life that brought you to the military? Like, how did you join at 18? I joined at 32. What was your life like?" And they would tell me about having to carry guns to school to make sure they don't get shot on the way to high school. One guy showed me pictures of a wall in his apartment torn down and said, "My stepfather did this to our house and put a knife to my mom, and I almost killed him. And I realized I have to leave home and join the military so I don't kill my stepfather." Young kids, one of my best friends, he was 18 when I met him. We're still friends to this day. He had to beat up a drug dealer that beat up his mother, right? The drug dealer put hands on his mother because his mother was getting into drugs, and he had to go protect her and beat him up and say, "If you ever come around my mom again, I will kill you." I mean, these are the soldiers that I was a leader of. And how could I not love them as human beings for coming into the military with this amount of trauma, this amount of betrayal from society, from their families, and they come in willing to serve and willing to lay their lives down and to better themselves. And so I learned so much about my assumptions about people, about what they look like or what they talk like or what they wear, what they do as hobbies. I realized at the end of the day, there is a raw, naked humanity about them that is so universally lovable and so universally relevant. It doesn't matter. The pain is pain. And me knowing that they've experienced that, there's there's just this instant connection and appreciation for the fact that they're alive. They're not in jail. They didn't make those decisions, and they're in the same uniform as me. The skin, there's no black and white in the military, we would say. There's only green. We don't care about colors of skin, shades of whatever you look like, whatever your culture is. I mean, we appreciate you. We love that you're in America and you're adding to the cultural diversity. But when we're here, we are all brothers and sisters under one color, and that's the green uniform that we have. And that allowed us to bond with each other in a way that was so outside the norm of society. And it was, I mean, talk about validation. This is stuff that it just fed me. It fed that young childhood self of mine that felt like I want to be invisible. I want to hide from the shame that I feel from things that happened to me. But yet at the same time, I do want to connect with others. I do want to belong. And so being in uniform kind of allowed me to walk in both of those tensions, if you will. And it's really neat because other people around me got it. The soldiers, we had this day where suicidality was increasing during the lockdowns. And so we had this kind of emergency meeting with our units. We broke out into our squad elements and we started talking about what we're really struggling with at home alone during the lockdowns, right? And so soldiers started talking about, "Hey, I was, sexually abused when I was younger. I was physically abused. This is what's going on in my family. I've never told anyone. I mean, the stuff that came out was far more than what's going on in the lockdown. We were crying, we were hugging each other. There was no rank in those meetings. It was just human to human connection. And that day was one of the most powerful days. That was actually the day that my soldier disclosed to me that he had survived his suicide attempt, because a couple days prior he had made that attempt. Didn't expect to wake up and regain consciousness, and he did. We had talked about it before for a while, but he came up to me in that meeting and said, look, if we're all going to be real, he's like, you know how you were checking in on me to see if I was doing okay mentally, and I told you I was okay? I lied to you. And I want to let you know, I'm sorry, that I lied to you, but I did make an attempt. And I just told him, I said, well, first of all, I'm so grateful you're alive. First of all, I'm thankful that you're living and breathing and standing in front of me, and I'm not standing in front of your coffin right now, because that was the alternative reality. And second of all, why the heck would you do that? You're such a cool person. Do not take yourself out of this world. Like, I love you. I love that you're in this platoon. You're so valuable. You're precious to us. Don't remove yourself. Don't ever feel like you have to do that. And all of this came from this moment of vulnerability with our platoon and with the squads. A lot of it had to initially started off with, let's break some barriers here. Let's connect as humans. Let's appreciate each other for the fact that we're all struggling right now, and we're all struggling together. All we have is each other, guys. Everything sucks here. The lockdowns suck. The mission sets are rough. The op tempo is high. We're constantly in the field. But you know what we have? We have each other. So let's be here for each other. And we showed up. You know what I mean? It was so cool. And so this book is a shout out to First Platoon for sure.
Yeah, I loved reading about that in the book. And so was that an event that you guys created, this support group that was repeated at a period of time, or was that a one-time event that you guys had? I wasn't sure when you told that story in the book.
So that was the significant day. That was a one-time event that day, but we did have multiple discussions like this. That was the most intense, meaning we know something's up, guys. This is getting critical. There were multiple touch points, but just like with my soldier who was able to say, no, I'm okay. Like, I'm all right. Things are, they were, it wasn't the intensity wasn't, this is how service members, this is how soldiers are. I mean, we have dark humor. We can bottle up a lot, right? This was a moment where it's like, guys, if someone doesn't speak up, we're gonna be short a person. Okay. And we know that it's things are getting critical, right? And I felt it. I could see it in people's posture. They say when soldiers are griping, it's not a big deal. Everyone's healthy. It's when they go quiet, right? That's when you know something's up. And that is what was happening. People across the board were getting quiet. Oof, man, I'm gonna take a second to kind of um yeah, that was real. That was a moment where we could have lost some people, and you wouldn't expect it. War people that I would think as a war hero, right? They'd never say that, but people that I look up to, strong people, right, were actually considering taking themselves out, like seriously considering taking themselves out. And that's not a joke. That's not something that should be taken lightly. And I know people had said it's a cry for help. Don't give them attention, because if you do, it's going to more people are it's going to make it a thing. If you call it out, if you let them talk, they're going to complain more. It's going to get more real. So just they need to bury it, and they need to just Charlie Mike, just carry on with the mission. Not the way to go about with mental health, right? That is a very dangerous game, and I would not play that game.
I I could I get so angry when I hear individuals say that. So angry. I have lost several friends to suicide. I have myself, when I was 13, attempted suicide and have been suicidal as an adult as a consequence of, and when I talk to individuals that don't really, typically when I hear individuals say those comments, what it says to me is, you don't get it. You have not been there yet. Because if you've been there, then you would never, ever, ever, ever say that. For me, I would say after my kidnapping and I escaped, and when I left the state, I did all of these things. And then I had 6 months where I had zero sleep, debilitating nightmares. The doctors couldn't find any drugs at all. There was a reason they use sleep deprivation as torture in the military. There is a reason. At some point, I no longer had a life worth living. Okay. And at some point, and individuals would say to me, why are you suicidal? You have a daughter. You're incredibly successful. You have this big career, all of these things. And what I, and of course, then they would say, you're being so selfish. And I remember saying to my doctors, these individuals do not get it. Like, at what point in my life, especially when you have individuals such as ourselves who had a lot of childhood trauma, a lot of loss, and a lot of these other things. And I said to my doctor, I said, I'm sorry, at what point in my life do I get to have peace and select to have peace? Why are these individuals saying this to me? Now, I will say this. I am very glad that I continued to fight. I am very glad that I had individuals who cared, that I went to treatment centers that had different modalities, that saw and didn't give up on me, and that I found outlets. I am so grateful for that. However, if you are sitting listening to any of these episodes and thinking that these individuals saying this are just looking for paying for attention and you should ignore them, or if you're thinking that that individual who appears very happy and appears very smiling, whatever, that they are not at risk, then you are wrong. And that is not the case. So I will now get off of my high horse on that. Okay, so I do want to talk about, in the book, you talk about coming back. And so I know that when I've talked to vets that have come back, and also I'm not going to be able to, these are not related to each other, but kind of they are. Okay. So I've done work, for example, with a group called Back on My Feet that also has a lot of individuals actually who were vets who then became addicts and then ended up maybe in prison and then got out of prison and didn't have a good transition plan. But really what I'm trying to make the correlation is individuals who go from a high combat area or high structured area, and then they go back into society. And the combat is now maybe an argument with their spouse or an argument with their work, and it's not on the battlefield. And they have to learn how. And I know you talk about this, the difference in the combat, how that struggle is real, and how, I believe in one of the sections, you talk about one of the individuals saying how amazing his wife was, that she got resources from other wives saying, okay, here's how you set him up to be successful as he integrates. Can you talk a little bit about how individuals coming back can kind of integrate back into society? And then also some of the tools. I know you mentioned some of the tools that you use. One was lavender, which is my favorite, lavender, bath salts. I can't remember if you talked about meditation or mindfulness. I feel like you did, but I can't remember for sure. But can you kind of talk about what those transitions look like? Some of the risks, some of the tools, and maybe some thoughts and advice you might give both to the individuals and to the community and family members.
Wow, yeah. I mean, this could be 10 podcasts, right? Let me start off by saying when it comes to I guess the neurophysiological implications of this, what I would try to educate soldiers on is to downregulate their, fight flight response, their amygdala, their hypervigilance, their situational awareness. Because in the military, and look, I was never combat deployed, right? But even in a training environment, we push ourselves to be as stressed out as what war would look like. And I've served with men and women who've been to Afghanistan and Iraq, and they told me that it was actually less stressful in a combat zone based on the level of training we were hitting at some of our high tempo points, which is insane to think about. What's important is for us to appreciate the fact that there are dials and knobs in our brains, theoretically, to turn down these systems, right? To turn down the amount of cortisol and adrenaline going through our veins, because we're always on standby for stuff. We're always just one text message away from everybody spin up, grab your weapons, grab your stuff, meet up at the vehicles. We're going on a movement, right? And so even when you go to sleep at night, something rustles and you just wake up in this shudder, grabbing for your radio and your weapon, get out of there. But then you realize, oh, I'm on the beach on a vacation. Holy smokes, right? So The hypervigilance is real with us for sure. And so it's important for people to appreciate what our nervous system does. And that also we've dialed it up a little bit too high for the duration that it's on, right? It's not the cortisol response that those neurotransmitters and those hormones in our body should not be there for extended periods of time. That's why leadership is so important here because leaders can help decompress. They can help us have that release valve, that pressure release valve to say, go home early, take a day off, go be with your families. Let me know if you need anything. That's so critical to do that for those that you lead. When people do come back to society, this is where self care is so important. And whatever self care practices work for you, do that. It could be anything from finger painting and interpretive dance to going to the range and shooting to surfing, making music, just relaxing, yoga, meditation, whatever it is. But we need to instill in our service members, especially self care practices that are pragmatic, that are useful, and that are personalized. And so that's one thing that I noticed when I talked to my soldiers about that. I remember one female, she came up to me and was like, "Hey, sir, can I talk to you about something real quick?" And I was like, "Yeah, what's up?" And she was like, "Hey, you mentioned that you meditate. Can you teach me? Like, what does that look like? What do you do when you meditate?" And I told her, it's like, wow, this is, I mean, I barely even remember saying that. She's like, "Yeah, you mentioned, and I heard you." And more of these conversations were coming up. And I'm not trying to make myself look like a paragon here, but of excellence or anything, but this is just because of the recovery journey I've went through. These were tools that I offered. Guy was telling me, "Hey, I've had some anger issues." My wife noticed. She noticed that I'm a certain person at home that she didn't marry, and that's getting a little bit alarming to her. And he said, "When I heard you talk about how you're not going to allow certain circumstances to make you angry, you'll take a breath and you'll chill. And I'm expecting you to blow up, but you don't." He said, "I talked to my wife about that, and she said that I need to learn to be like that a little bit more, so I don't bring anger home and create a domestic incident," which happened to one of my soldiers and led to their divorce, which was devastating. It's heavy stuff talking about this, right? Because it still kick myself. I wish I could have helped him out with that. Self care practices are huge. And so, what I would say is, especially if you are a spouse, if you're a partner to somebody in the military, encourage them to pursue self care practices that allow them to recenter themselves so they can be the genuine person that they are underlying all that stress and tension that's built up. It's easier said than done, but it's so critical for us to figure that out. And there's no one size fits all. It's a process. There's ups and downs to it. There's an experimental process. You got to find out what works for you. But again, I can rant for days about this. It's so important to allow that space for service members to not feel ashamed of themselves, for acknowledging the fact that they have neurophysiological aspects of their mind that deserve decompression. There's no touchy feely way around this. There's no way people can say, "I don't want to talk about this. It's, you're making us soft, or you're making the military weaker." It's like, well, tell me, would you say that I'm weak for telling you to maintain your vehicle, to maintain your weapons? No, that's a tactical item. That's a tactical machine that we use in warfare. Okay, well, what about a human being's brain? What about these men and women that are carrying these weapons, that are driving these vehicles? Their brain that is in charge of making these split second decisions, right? That can end up in a loss of life if they miscalculate. And we're not allowing them to be maintained. I mean, that is appalling to me. And so that's, oof, yeah, talk about a soapbox. I need to chill. But my goodness, if we can just be restorative in the way that we lead, then we're going to see better decisions made. We're going to see less collateral damage. It's going to be a smoother operating machine and less suicidality. That's the biggest take home.
I would love to see, and I say this a lot with the prison population. I just did an interview with Dr. Gabriel Constance that's going to go live in the next couple of weeks. Actually, by the time yours goes live, it will already be live. So he wrote a book, Brave 52 Weeks of Mindfulness, and he goes into a lot of prisons, hospice, places like that, teaching mindfulness, which I just like, my heart swelled because I love the idea of teaching individuals in a population before they go back into society to where they're going to go back to work and back into their families, mindfulness techniques, how powerful that is to healing. And I do not believe, especially in the United States, I know we have listeners in different countries, but in the United States, so I can only speak for the United States, I do a very poor job of integrating individuals from the military back into society. I really feel like there should be a 6-week course of just bringing the families back together and teaching some like, hey, let's try out these different hobbies. Let's try out these mindfulness and meditation, and let's practice conflict resolution. Let's, figure out, okay, the spouse has been doing these activities without you, and let's figure out how we reintegrate. I really wish there was like a 6-week family transition period that would do that in both of these instances, because I would have to believe if we invested the time and the resources and the money in that, then the amount of savings that we would have in medications and crime and divorce, in sick days for individuals that have stress and complications of that would be tremendous. So if anyone's listening and they want to take that on as a passion project, go for it. I would love that. That would just make me so happy. Dan, are there any of the stories that you've recently been told that individuals say, hey, please share my story? Is there any story that you want to make sure you share today before we end our time together?
I would say, man, that's rough. There's been a recent story that was shared that was pretty heavy. I don't really feel comfortable sharing it right now, other than I'll tell you the back end of the story, maybe not the intense part of it, but the back end was, hey, I'm going to open up to you about some stuff. And the reason I'm doing it, this individual told me, is so you can use it as a tool. It's a resource to you. My story from what I experienced in combat, if it can save a life, then use it. And this is what's cool. This individual has struggled with suicidality and has overcome that, and has it's always, there's always going to be a struggle. Those scars are real, right? The wounds are real. Just the heart that this combat vet has to say, speak about what I went through so other people don't feel alone, is that's the ultimate connection. That's the ultimate story here, is that we allow people to recognize their story in somebody else, to say, hey, all right, if this person made it through, then I do have a chance. Right. And so that's the heart of the message here, that it's going to be dirty. It's going to be messy. Recovery is it's a gross journey sometimes, because as my buddy says, the nasty comes out and you're not medicating it and you're not pushing it back down and numbing out. You're allowing things to surface. But what's cool is that's a part of the growth journey. You allow the dark stuff to come out and you process it. You grieve what needs to be grieved. You get it out of your body and feel those feelings and grow through them. And the only way to do that is with community. We got to do it knowing that somebody else made it. And this is a brother or sister of mine that is going to help guide me, and we're going to walk alongside each other. And so I would say, yeah, the biggest story that impacted me is just that heartfelt message he gave me of, please share this because it could potentially save someone's life. And I'm all about that. I hope it does. I hope this book really helps people feel less alone if they are struggling where they think they're by themselves. But I would say you're not by yourself. I mean, I've been there too. We isolate when we're hurting. One of my buddies, JP, he's a double amputee, lost both of his legs to a 200-pound IED and more. And I always give him credit for this. When people thank him for his service, he says, you're worth it. And I told him, I said, JP, I'm stealing that, bro, but I'll give you credit. So I tell people, if you're struggling, if you feel alone, you feel trapped, you're stuck in that rumination, you're ashamed of what you've done or what you've seen or what's been done to you, you're worth it. You're worth the recovery. You're worth the journey through it. It's not past it. You got to go through it. It sucks. And I get that it sucks, but the suck is where you're not alone. That suffering is where you're not alone. The only trick you got to figure out is how to convince your brain, when your brain swears to you you're the only person in the universe going through this, that you're really not. I know that feeling. I've been around men and women in uniform who live that feeling out and who have to battle with it. And I just want to say again, you're worth it. So don't do it alone. I don't have all the answers. I'm just another voice in the discussion, but it's a valuable discussion. And thank you so much for having this discussion on your podcast, for giving space to this stuff, because it's complex. There's a lot of gray areas, and what a beautiful thing that, you're willing to allow that tension to exist here. And that to me is reality, so thanks for that.
Absolutely. On a previous episode, we talked about, and this was on episode 15, where Jody shared her recovery story of opiate addiction from starting at age 7 with migraines. And she and I met at the same treatment center, and a therapist there, and I think this is a common phrase, used to say, for those who are listening who feel like you have no hope, then I'll share this because I'm going to put words in Dan's mouth, but I feel confident he feels the same way I do, that Dan and I will hold hope for you until you can have hope for yourself.
Yeah, that's perfectly said. I love it.
Yeah, absolutely. So listeners, Dan did donate to our auction that is October 26th through the 28th of 2023. He donated an autographed copy of his book, Backpack to Rucksack. You can also get a copy on Amazon, I know, because I purchased my own copy and read it in preparation for this interview. So you can get your own copy on Amazon, or you can wait and get an autographed copy and donate to Recovery Advocate Network at the auction. So Dan, one of the requirements I have of all guests is I want to know your favorite motivational quotes. I hope you remembered to bring your favorite motivational quotes for us to end today with.
My favorite motivational quote is "Get after it," and that's by my friend Jocko Willink. And it's just a reminder to stand up and lean into whatever it is in front of you. I love it because it starts with you. That ownership starts with you, who you are in the midst of wherever you're at. So you have it in you. If I have it in me, you definitely have it in you. So get after it, whatever it is, be motivated to pursue and conquer it.
Perfect. Well, listeners, you have your task. So go do it. Get after it. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you so much.
Wow, listeners, you just listened to episode number 18 and the third in our book club series, Backpack to Rucksack, Insight into Leadership and Resilience from Military Experts. This episode inspired me even more as I prepared to publish it. I cannot wait to read future books by Dan. If you want more information about Dan, please visit his website, www.combatpsych.com, and you can purchase his book on Amazon. I've included both of the links in the show notes, so check it out. Dan also donated an autographed copy of his book. That book also includes my notes as I prepared for this interview and was signed by both Dan and myself as the official book club series book. It will be available in our fundraising auction being held October 26th through the 28th of 2023. Yes, that is in a couple of weeks. Thanks, Dan, so much for your generosity and your time. As a reminder, the experiences and advice expressed in this episode are the host and guest's own personal stories and do not represent the opinions of any organization mentioned. RAN is passionate about opening the doors for all voices and experiences, not just those expressed in any particular podcast. If you want to share your experiences or expertise, we encourage you to be a future guest by emailing us at podcast@recoveryadvocatenetwork.org or submit a blog post by emailing blog@recoveryadvocatenetwork.org. We just started a new blog series called Between the Lines, where we will read select blog posts on the podcast. So submit your blog today. We also encourage you to comment on the episode so that we can continue to provide content that is most beneficial to the community. If you do, we'll even give you a shout out. We are proud that every individual working with RAN does so on a 100% volunteer basis. You can support the mission by clicking the love, not like, icon on our podcast and subscribing. The reception of this podcast has blown us away, and hence we are seeking a volunteer podcast publishing assistant. If you're interested, please email us at podcast@recoveryadvocatenetwork.org. We hope you will connect with us at www.recoveryadvocatenetwork.org, where you can donate to the mission, read those blog posts, and stay in the loop about upcoming events, including that fundraising auction that includes Dan's book as well as other book club books. some amazing signed footballs by amazing players, and a personalized guitar donated by the band Bon Jovi. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Recovery Advocate Network and on Twitter at Ran to Wellness so that you don't miss out. Now, listeners, seriously, pause what you're doing right now, subscribe and follow us. Please give us a 5-star rating and provide some feedback, and share these episodes with your friends. You never know whose heart you will touch. We already have listeners in, as I mentioned, 16 countries around the world, so be a part of the reason someone has new hope today. If this episode was triggering to you, we encourage you to contact your support system, therapist, national and community support groups, the Global Crisis Text Line by texting 741-741, and if you're in the United States, dialing 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. If you live in a country outside of the United States and have information for helpful resources, please email us so that we can provide those to listeners. And if you want to provide feedback, leave it in the comments on the episode or email us. Now, we know you're busy. Thanks for joining us today, and back to your coffee.